this session in this room is going to be a panel. We already have seen two of the panelists today. We are now joined by Salvör Nordal, who is the director of the Center of Ethics at University of Iceland. And so these distinguished panelists will now attack this issue of ethics in AI and technology. And we're also joined by, sorry, again, Þorbjörn Kristjánsson, who is a philosopher and has been working also with Chris in the past. So I'll give the floor to the panel, and definitely bring up your notebooks and write down your questions.
I'm sorry, I must say that I didn't have the privilege to read or to view their presentations. So some of the questions they might already have given answers to, but we'll just get their answers again then.
No, we'll just say answered.
Yeah, or that yeah. All right. So the first class of questions I have pertains to killer robots. There seem to be nearly endless possibilities by which an armed robot used in warfare can impact the ethical principles surrounding war. I believe you, Professor Sharkey, have stated that the principles of discrimination and proportionality are among those. Can you explain this a bit further to our audience?
I think I have answered that one.
Yeah, true.
Can you hear us okay without microphones?
Yeah, so all these mics are on.
I'm just thinking, can you hear us at the very back? Okay.
So I think you answered the sub question as well. So I'll move on to question two.
Why don't you ask your question, because you haven't spoken yet?
Or you could start with well, you know.
Yeah, I mean, everybody, of course, can pitch in their views. So I'm not requiring only one person to speak. So, okay. My next question was: warfare has changed dramatically in terms of tactics. Sorry, I'm gonna just get myself a bit more comfortable here. Warfare has changed dramatically in terms of tactics. We have gone from face-to-face combat in the American Revolutionary War to a theater of war which is vastly different. Since the end of the Cold War, war and military tactics have changed. Today, Western nations are fighting an enemy which is hard to identify and whose tactics consists of waging war amongst civilians, attacking in an extremely swift and unexpected manner. By facing such a force, some have argued that conventional warfare, which ideally adheres to the laws of war, cannot win in such a way. Do you think we could argue convincingly that the use of autonomous weapon systems is permissible because it is our best chance to counter these new ways of waging war?
Shall I speak first? Yeah. No. But the reason is that I mean, that's the worst case for insurgent war. And you mentioned the American Civil War, but that's where terrorism began. Except they were called freedom fighters. It just depends on which side you're on. Because the Americans started civilian-dressed bombing the British redcoats.
Oh, right, yeah.
But I think the whole thing of insurgent warfare is really interesting because the reason why I'm not for this kind of bombing, suicide bombing, but you have to understand the reasons for it. And the reason, in the same way that in Ireland, the Irish army, who have only ever fought the English, they have never been at war with anybody else. But that was because England was an occupying force. And the reason why they resorted to bombing people in that kind of way, and they didn't want to do it, they had a big meeting about it, because the Irish army, which was really inferior, kept lining up against the British army in the battlefield and get slaughtered all the time. But by changing their tactics, they managed to get independent Ireland within months. of doing it. So the British had been using very underhanded tactics by sending in intelligence officers, and so the IRA decided in the end that they would do the same and look at intelligence and start doing this kind of. So Churchill had selected the 30 best Secret Service people that he had and sent them to Ireland. But the IRA had got the intelligence and assassinated all 30 of them simultaneously, and they were distributed throughout the country. And then Britain gave Ireland freedom. So, you know, I think that if people are pushed into a corner, they can either just lie down and accept occupation and accept someone else's values. And sometimes the only way they have to fight is with an insurgent war. And I think we're just going to see more and more of it. The more powerful the West becomes, the more insurgent war there's going to be. Yeah. And the high technology, rather than helping that, is actually creating more of it. Because, for example, when we talk about, sorry, I'm going to talk too long now. But when we talk about drone strikes, for instance, there's a really good report called Living Under Drones by New York University and Stanford Law Schools. And they went to, I can't remember if it was Yemen or Somalia. I think it was Yemen. And what they found was that the population was suffering from post-traumatic stress, because these things make an awful lot of noise. They're petrol engine, two-stroke, the Predators, and they all the time. And they're buzzing overhead. And most of their use is for surveillance. So they're buzzing overhead, doing surveillance all the time. But every so often, there's just a and people die, because there's Hellfire missiles come out. So you don't know with the buzzing overhead all the time you're going to die or not. Children had stopped going to school because they don't want to be seen in groups. For instance, people don't like to collect at all, and lots of people are dying. So when they went and did the analysis, they had no baseline condition, unfortunately, but they reckoned that there was a really increased high post-traumatic stress among the population. Now, what that does in the end is that it recruits terrorists, recruits more people. People I've met from Somalia, for instance, have told me about how they hadn't even heard of Al-Qaeda or anything until the Americans started doing drone strikes, and suddenly the numbers went from a couple of hundred to tens of thousands. So you could say that new technology is perhaps one of the best recruitment tools for getting more insurgency than it is in helping. So that would be my answer. It's answering your question, actually.
Yeah, I think there's a more general issue here, which is if knowledge, whether it's of technology or some other kind of knowledge, but we're talking about technology, if knowledge gets sort of locked up in a small group that then is in a position to abuse that knowledge, chances are, of course, they will abuse it. Or at least even if they don't that time, some other point in time, circumstances may be different. So interestingly enough, this comes back to my comment about scientists having to publish their work and informing everyone, as wide a group as possible of their work, because it's one way to combat the kind of uneven distribution of knowledge and power, in a sense, and thus a way to battle the increasing tensions and possibly wars and so on, terrorist acts that could happen. Yeah. So.
Okay.
And that's, of course, the definition of science is to be open. Science is supposed to be open, and all the results of any sort of scientific, so we can question if it's a science within the military, in that sense, or in other companies where it's closed off.
Yeah. So the funding, for instance, of DARPA, which has funded a vast majority of AI research, in fact, or at least had a hand every decade in its progression. Interestingly enough, they do it primarily via universities, U.S. universities, and so of course the faculty in these universities is obliged to publish their work. Which means, if they want to make this into some kind of a weapons system, it's not going to be developed in the universities. The knowledge gets created there, but then they hire contractors to put things together.
They develop the components.
Yeah.
But DARPA is actually a really good, I approve of their method of research. I don't approve of what they're researching. But they're not accountable, so they just fund anything. They fund craziness, like, a tank being controlled by a rat's hippocampus. So their idea is that one thing comes up that's good. That would be enough. And I think certainly in my country, we have a lot of universities, and we tend to give funding to, luckily I'm one of the better ones, but we tend to give funding to the so-called better universities and maintain a very tight thing as opposed to spreading it out wide. But DARPA are also responsible for the internet. It was called they used to be called ARPA. So the first time I ever used the internet was the ARPANET throughout the 70s and 80s. They're also responsible for GPS. Mm-hmm. So we all use it every day. I mean, they used to be very tight with it. I mean, in the 90s and early 2000s, it had a 150-meter margin of error because they didn't want other people using it for targeting, but now they target with it.
Nevertheless, these technologies got locked up, especially GPS, for decades on end, specifically for the military to use. So you could say that due to their funding of this work, which of course ultimately actually turned out to benefit a lot of people, was heightened the tension, certainly globally. And since they didn't let any other countries in, of course, it creates tension between countries, either especially countries with not deep enough pockets to send out all those satellites themselves and copy this system.
Sorry to interrupt. I think we need to move on soon. Should I go on to the next question?
Sure.
Okay, yeah, sure. I'd like to turn the attention to questions concerning responsibility. As I believe everyone here knows, reasonable adults are to be held responsible for their actions, both morally and legally. Even today, we are faced with difficult questions concerning responsibility when it comes to artificial intelligence. One of these difficulties pertains to warfare. Generally, people who commit war crimes are held responsible for what they have done, but in the past, these have usually been people actively engaged in battle. What do you see as some of the major challenges that teleoperated drones pose regarding the enforcement of international humanitarian laws?
It's a big question. Well, one of the problems, we'll just give you one of them because that's too much to say. One of the problems is in what you call international conflict, and the big argument at the Human Rights Council in the UN over drones and various, there are these people at the UN called special rapporteurs, and they write reports. And succession of special rapporteurs have complained to the General Assembly about the United States' use of drones, saying that there were violations of human rights because the United States is in not any kind of official conflict with Pakistan. They're not in any kind of official conflict with Somalia, the Yemen, or I forget the other country. There's another small country they've been attacking, Niger. Now, they're not at any kind of official conflict with them, unlike them in Afghanistan and Iraq. But nonetheless, they're sending in drone strikes and killing people there. Now, what the human rights lawyers and the human rights people are arguing generally is that there are two sets of rules that can govern us, kind of thing. One set is international humanitarian law, which is the laws of war. Now, what the United States are doing is they're using the laws of war in things that are not war. Okay, so if these are not official conflicts, they should not be under the laws of war. And what that means is a much tighter humanitarian law. And humanitarian law, for instance, would not allow collateral damage. You don't go killing, the police don't go bombing buildings to get one guy. and kill hundreds of others. So they're in breach of, in violation of humanitarian law. Now, under humanitarian law, for instance, they should have the right to surrender. They should have the right to due process. So what's happening is that in the United States, and if you read the recent releases, this is certainly validated, a group of people get together, behind closed doors, they never reveal their choices of target. They just say, this is the target list, it goes to President Obama, and he signs it off, because he's given lots of reasons. They condense the reasons and pass them to him in something called a baseball card. So he gets a little baseball card with the target's name on it and explaining why it's important that they kill him. This is not revealed to anybody else and never will be, except by these hackers who get in and show us all what it's about. So there's no due process, there's no transparency. People are being selected for execution and being executed. And 3 American citizens have died as a result of that. One who was a genuine Al-Qaeda member, another who was his son, who was 16 years old, in a completely separate attack that had nothing to do with it. And there's a story that I met the parents of a boy who was 16 years old. I met his father because the mother was dead. The 16-year-old boy had gone to a seminar on collecting evidence of American drone strikes and the death of civilians. And what he did was he was given a camera, and he then managed to get funding to give lots of his friends cameras. So if there's a drone strike, he could go out and take the photograph. And he was driving his mother with his younger brother in the car to the doctor. He was driving his mother to the doctor. He was only 16, but there you could drive. And with his younger brother in the car, and was hit by a drone strike. Now, no reason was ever given for this, and no reason ever will be. There's no chance for any kind of review or exposure as to why, and that's why it's completely, I think, against international humanitarian law. It's one of the reasons, anyway, against humanitarian law. I'm stopping there.
That's right.
Can we have some questions that aren't about war?
Yeah, I actually have some. I have some questions about the ethics policy for AI. During last year's AI festival, Dr. Kristinn Thórisson presented a completed project in which an autonomous software was capable of learning social interaction. How significant do you believe this project will be for future developments in the field of robotics and artificial intelligence? And where does ethics fit into the picture here?
Yeah, that's a good question. You're referring to the Humanos project, which led to what I believe is the first system that actually learns by self-programming. And I think this project, in fact, is breaking new ground, but it's very, very early. Yes, people have been talking about self-programming systems for decades. In fact, since very early last century, and no one's really figured it out. Now, I think we have found one way to do it, and certainly, if you ever, think that this imaginary future that we see in the movies is ever going to happen, it will have to be through some sort of mechanism like that. Now, I'm not going to predict specifically about, the impact of this project on the future of research because, frankly, not very many people have looked at this work at all, and no one seems to want to publish it. So we'll see about that. But I would say, there are, I would point people's attention to the immediate dangers of technology, immediate risks, and so on, and try to sort things in an order of urgency. And frankly, I think that urgency is far below, for instance, rogue genetically modified viruses and killer robots. So, yeah, that's my answer.
Okay. Yeah.
Of course, we don't know the specific program. He's asked a very specific question. He's asked a very specific question about your program, so we don't know what. I've not seen it.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
I've not reviewed it, honestly.
Right.
But I would like to ask you, how does that differ from, because haven't seen it, but how does that differ from, because I thought I was doing that in 1981, how does that differ from standard machine learning or neural network learning or deep learning? Was it different from, or reinforcement learning?
Very different, because it essentially, we have one solution. I'm not going to say the solution. Everyone seems to be looking for the golden algorithm or the key to intelligence, but we have one solution to actually having a machine learn very complex tasks on its own after it leaves the lab. So we have achieved sort of the first stage of autonomy, which none of the other machine learning methods have. Essentially, every single machine learning algorithm out there assumes that you train it in the lab and then you turn off the learning and you let it loose. Our system actually is always learning. Its learning is always on. It has mechanisms for checking its own knowledge. So it's very different. And you know, to get there, we had to basically throw out all methodology. In fact, 90% of computer science to get there. And that's probably why no one wants to publish it. But there are papers already, non-peer-reviewed, detailed report on it on archive, which I can send you a link to.
I'd need to see the details, but I mean, a lot of us have been doing continuous learning for a long time. And the latest is Atari learning, so it just looks at the game and works out for itself that there's a game going on.
But you know that the duration of planning for those systems is about 2 or 3 frames of video frames. So it has no long-term learning, which means to talk about transfer learning for such a system is pointless, which means, you know, if you want to talk about real intelligence, it has to have transfer learning. I mean, the one thing you learned here must be transferable to that new thing there for you to get anywhere. And none of the AI systems we have today have that.
Should we take one more question and then turn to the audience?
Maybe we should shut you down now.
The last question is concerns neurological enhancement, which is of course one of the topics. Now I must admit I myself haven't studied, you know, the ethical issues of neurological enhancement at all, but I formed a very general question around it. So here it is. Closely related to robotics is the technology we have acquired to enhance human capabilities. Can you describe some of the main ethical challenges we face when confronted with this technology?
Shall I start?
Yeah,
okay. Well, I actually, and my Center for Ethics, we are part of not a research project, but it's a EU project, and we are discussing these things. And the idea is to have some events and get a general debate about the ethical issues and the concerns people have for neurological enhancement. And of course, I mean, there's a lot of speculations going on, but one of the concerns people have, and when we are thinking of the possibility of brain enhancement, having maybe much better memory or much better some sort of brain functioning than in normal person, is, I would say, maybe the most concerns regard equality and the possibility maybe of discriminate between people, those who are able to access this technology and those who are not, whether people will be pressed or under pressure to use it. If it's something that you can't really get a job unless you get enhanced, there are those kind of questions that people are sort of tackling. Yeah. So there's a lot of interest there. I mean, it's a very, obviously, and you probably know much more about the science in this, but it's something that there's a lot going on in this field. So, and there's a lot of ethical questions there. And they very much have to do with this. And of course, there's deep philosophical concerns about just the nature of human beings. Are we allowed to enhance sort of radically, and is that sort of people then use terms like human dignity? Are we going beyond human dignity when we do that? There's possibly a lot of risk involved. Do we know what we are doing? And but enhancement is an interesting term also, because it has the meaning is very positive. It seems we believe that enhancement must be good, but then that's one of the it's sort of a value it's a value laden term. So
Yeah.
so it's at least a start to answer this question.
I agree with what you say, but you can look at general drug enhancement as an example of that. But it's not really an enhancement either. What it does is it's mainly amphetamine driven, so it actually makes people concentrate more.
Yeah.
And the general view is that, like Ritalin, for instance, which is for ADHD, and it actually works. It doesn't work very well on stupid people, and it doesn't work very well on very smart people. It works on people who have a problem studying. Keeps them awake and keeps them focused.
It's a new kind of IQ test.
Yeah, that's right. But in that field, one of the big things is this idea of enhancement versus therapy. So when what's therapeutic
exactly.
versus enhancing.
And the sort of how to sort of discriminate between these two is not always obvious. When we are enhancing and when not.
And your warning there about people being forced to use it is already happening with Ritalin.
Yeah.
Because
yeah,
if you're in a workplace and people around you are working much harder and getting promoted, and you're not, it's a very strong temptation to take the thing.
Yeah.
But I worry about the machine enhancement. I think is sort of slightly crazy in some ways yet, because we have no idea how to do it. I mean, how do you plug in a piece of memory? We don't know how to do that. And when you look at the actual research going on, there are plenty of people going around telling you we're going to be all enhanced within the next 10 years. But if you look at the actual research, there's some really great research going on. For instance, there's little chips that you can sink into the deep brain that will indicate that you're going to have an epileptic fit in a few hours, and then tickle the cortex to stop the fit from happening. And that's obviously very therapeutic, but that, they say, is 10 years away from production. So this is not happening quickly.
No.
And the problem I have...
But they have some device for Parkinson's disease.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
that's another one.
So there's some,
they're really good.
Yeah.
But the idea of having more memory, here's a problem, sorry, I'm speaking as a psychologist now. One of the things, if you look at human memory in detail, is that when you get people with a very, very good memory, and there's a book by Luria called S, it's a book, The Mind of the Mnemist. He discovered this guy who couldn't forget anything. He remembered everything, and he had to. Unlike the rest of us, he had to develop techniques for forgetting. So you show him a blackboard covered with numbers, like 200, 1,000 numbers. He would remember that forever. So what he had to do was make a mental image of the blackboard being burnt down in order to forget those numbers. But the one problem he had, and people with very good memories generally have this problem, they're not good at abstraction. There seems to be a memory trade-off between abstraction, and I never hear any of the enhancement people saying this, but there seems to be a trade-off between high memory and being able to abstract, because essentially, I don't know, this is a crude theory, but the idea is that and you get better and better. At my age, I'm much better at abstraction than any of you lot, because I can't remember anything. so I mean, that's putting it in a nutshell. So if you could remember everything, you would not abstract, and that's one of the great features of being human, is this failing memory we have. Because you might think the idea of not having a good memory is functionless, but I think it's actually functional. So if you start enhancing people, you might be de-enhancing them.
Exactly.
You get a lot of automata.
So, excuse me, I think we need to
Move
wrap
on.
it up soon. Should we? It's very interesting. I mean, we could be here until 10 or 11 p.m. tonight. But is there? I think we turn the attention now to the audience. I think for about maybe 10 minutes of questions. Yep.
My question is for Dr. Noel Sharkey. And I'm wondering, is it more realistic to mandate non-lethal weapons on autonomous war machines? would that satisfy the stop killer robots part of the campaign? Or do you believe perhaps that they would be more dangerous to have them non-lethal, because then people would assume that it's non-lethal, and then you could replace the lethal weapon with the non-lethal weapon with a lethal weapon?
You kind of answered the question. But that's a very important question, and it's one of the reasons why we don't like the UN. The UN have a very good term for these. They call them lethal autonomous weapon systems. And it's a good term because it's a nice acronym. It's laws. But we're against that because we like to talk about not the application of lethal force, but the application of violent force. And the idea of a less than lethal weapon is nonsense. In the United States, for instance, an Amnesty International report has shown that the use of tasers by the United States authorities has led to something like 300 deaths. So you might call them lethal. You might think they call it less than lethal rubber bullet. But if you look at pictures of people who've been hit by a rubber bullet and had their faces blown off and things, they can be lethal. So we're against the use of... The first thing that when I met the head of the US delegation to the UN, I know him quite well now, but he approached me very brusquely at the time in a meeting with lots of DOD people. And he just said, I want to ask you, what do you want? Would you allow us to have less than lethal weapons on board? And I said, not even water pistols. So that would be my answer to that.
Kind of phrase it in the sense of weapon is a weapon.
Yes.
It's a lethal or not. It's a repetition of lethal weapon, non-lethal weapon.
And it's hard to work out which one's being used at any time as well, so it makes it really muddy, yeah.
Is there a question over here?
You had your talk, was the Sharkey, I saw a lot of correlations between what you were talking about with weapons and just like the problems arising with self-driving cars in general. For example, they might have to make the decision like rulers or divers in some cases. And the same problems with who is responsible. Maybe, do you have any thoughts on where we should take that and what laws?
The manufacturer is responsible, in my view. But there's kind of a craziness being talked there. It's quite good philosophy, as we were talking earlier. It's the trolley problem, what you call the trolley problem, put into reality. And I hear car manufacturers now, like the head of Daimler, talking about developing an ethics policy for cars. And the idea is that with the autonomous car is that imagine the car's going to get into an accident. There's all sorts of things happening on a bridge. Now, the car is self-driving, and this is not possible really, but anyway, the car is self-driving, so it has to make a decision about what to do in the circumstance of the accident. Should it drive off the bridge, killing you because you're sitting in the car? Should it hit the guy on the bicycle? Should it run into the school bus? Should it hit a SUV, which is a bit more robust vehicle? So the car's actually deciding who to kill. And that seems craziness to me, because at that point, it means that every time the car approaches an accident, as you say, the analogy with warfare, it then becomes a weapon that's choosing who to target. And there's something really wrong with that. And if you say that, people will say, well, do you think it's better to throw a dice? And quite frankly, I don't know, but I think that is the wrong approach. I don't know what the right approach is, but that is definitely not a good approach. I mean, it would be crazy. And other people have suggested, well, you might not want to have yourself killed, so you could adjust the ethical settings on your car. Now you've got a bunch of autonomous cars, and who knows what will happen. Never mind the technical difficulties. In an accident, it's dynamic. You can't see what's happening behind cars. You can't actually see who's in the car. And I've said to the car manufacturers, if you do this, I'm never going to travel without a crowd of babies with me, because then I'm safe.
Any more questions? Yeah, well.
My question is to Dr. Kristinn. How has, since you made the ethics policy public, how has has it gained some momentum, and what are other faculties saying? And this time next year, will we have seen exponential growth in ethics policies?
Let me take that last one first. I'd be crazy to predict that there will be an exponential growth in adoption of such policies. Although I have had some conversations with colleagues about this possibly, having the potential to go viral. I'm not too optimistic about that, and frankly, I think the response has been basically of two kinds. For those who have already thought about any of these things, very positive response. From those who haven't really thought about it too much, no response whatsoever. And I guess in retrospect that's to be expected, but I'm a bit curious as to why more people are not intrigued, at least.
I think it's a great idea, and I'm more optimistic than you. I think it has to start somewhere. And there is definitely a lot more. A lot of the European grants now want ethical committees on them. And I'm on a number of those ethical committees, and I've never, ever once been asked for any advice. But you tick a box and you get the funding.
Exactly.
It's true.
And I want to congratulate you as an ethicist, because this is a very important, I think,
But what do you guys think about the whole... Can I just ask them a question?
Sure.
And myself. I was just hoping we could say something more generally about the ethical issues, really, because there are many, many ethical issues in AI, and there's things like, and I don't think that you're addressing those, but things like unemployment, for instance, which is definitely dramatically increasing because of AI. There's lots of predictions now from people writing books on it that I've seen the figures. A lot of people, 100,000 people were put out of work in New York as stockbrokers. You might not be sympathetic to stockbrokers after what happened, but 100,000 of them. And so it's not just your dull, dirty and dangerous jobs, it's starting to turn to high-level jobs. And there's high levels of unemployment predicted over the next 30 or 40 years. And it comes up, I've been in lots of meetings with the chairman of Google, etc., and they're all saying, well, this is great, isn't it? Because you'll all be able to just sit around and think or do whatever you like. And I say, are you going to fund that? And they say, so.
Sorry,
but that's one of the ethical issues. But there are so many more, aren't there?
Yeah. So I think should we take.
Let us answer that.
I agree.
Okay, sure,
I'm not very good at this. I'm learning too. No, but I agree. I think there's the unemployment. I don't think people are really thinking too much about it. So, but I think we should go ahead with the question.
But I think that people should generally just feel that they are socially responsible and watch out all the time, because there are so many things happening in technology now, and it's impossible to keep up with it, really. Lawyers certainly can't keep up with it, so it's important for people to be alert, technical people especially, and keep pushing policies all the time. It's your social responsibility to do so.
Yeah.
And I thought it was very interesting that what you were talking about, the speed, because I think that's I started to think about the financial market in the when you were talking about weapons and the speed, because I think the technology is going really so fast and so much faster than we are really keeping up with, and the regulation, of course, are just lagging so much behind, and the speed has a lot to do with it.
What some of us are trying to do at the minute to do this is, because you can't keep up with the technology, but what you can do is we're pushing for a charter for technological rights for humans, so that if it violates your rights, then it shouldn't be made. And that's one way of doing it. So you don't have to keep up with the technology has to respect the human in the loop.
One of my favorite quotes is actually, technology gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom.
That's good.
Which I think is really, really descriptive of this. But sorry to cut you off, but should we take one more question before the beer gets cold outside? I think I saw a question up there.
Just the last maybe because of the ethics policy. And of course, I'm sitting here actually as one that would like to adopt it, in fact, for the patent, but it's good I am, obviously. But I'm still, there's one part of the policy that is maybe tricky to implement, and I want to get the views of the other panelists about that. I know Chris's view on it, but this is kind of the association with an entity that is funded by military money, not receiving directly military funding for your projects. Or you're actually saying you won't only work on peaceful projects. But is it possible to implement this association with the research community that is largely military funded? Or is that something that is possible to do today?
Well, I think
I have something to say as well.
if my predictions are correct, and I think in this case they actually have turned out to be, that AI has an enormously wide range of applicability and usage, then if it's so generally applicable to in various ways to both for better or good, we need to look, of course, we need to try to steer things towards what benefits society rather than what heightens tensions and so on. And I think people will draw that threshold differently, which is one of the reasons why we release this under a Creative Commons license, because as much as I'm convinced that this ethics policy exactly in its current form may not be adopted in very many places, I'm very hopeful that a version of it which retains a significant part of its content will. And so I think this is something we'll have to see, but it puzzles me how few research institutions have an explicit policy of some sort along these lines. Because frankly, I think the number of research institutions that are focusing on civilian uses of AI are increasing by the minute. So I think it's ripe for adoption, frankly.
I would say I wouldn't be against someone what I wouldn't like to see is a situation of someone saying, well, I'm taking military funding, so sod it, I might as well do everything bad. So I think it's perfectly legitimate to be able to take military funding and still be a socially responsible ethical organization. I don't think if you're actually making autonomous weapons, you could be that. But I mean, I know people who are working military funding, working on little robots that climb over the ship's hull to clean them before they leave docks because it costs a fortune for miners to do it. Sorry, divers to do it. I said miners. So they clean the ship's hulls. And I wouldn't accept military funding myself, but you have to be realistic, and I would not put it on people not to accept it. In fact, in the campaign, we have one company that's signed up with us and has been to the UN and talked, called ClearPath Robotics, who've developed a very definite policy saying they will not make autonomous weapons. Now, they're a major military contractor for Canada, and they say they're the only company in Canada that's capable of making autonomous weapon systems. But they said that they draw the line there, and they've given the reasons they don't believe it can be, it's morally correct, and so they've cut off there. And they have an ethics policy, but nonetheless they make other stuff for the military, like bomb disposal robots and remote control things. So I think I wouldn't turn somebody away from the. It's like St. Peter at the gates of heaven. You don't turn people away because they've done some work with the military.
Well,
So
I think
don't
it's very important to be able to do this, and I do sure hope that you will be able to implement it and really work by these guidelines. And I think because what we see sort of in ethics is that very often, as you were saying, that research labs, whether in this field or other fields, are not really aware of the ethical questions, and they don't really take them up or really try to answer them. So I think that is really definitely the first step to realize that there are ethical issues and they are really important, and try to implement them. And I really appreciate that.
Yep.
Should we conclude here? I think we're far past the time. Sorry about that, but we can all speak to each other during the exhibition. So yeah, thank you very much.